99% of the people who have ever spent a dollar have never asked what happens on the day the promise printed on it stops being believed. The United States does not have to guess. The country ran the experiment twice, once between 1775 and 1781, and again between 1861 and 1865, and both times a national paper currency fell all the way to zero while the government that issued it insisted, in print, right up to the end, that the money was sound. Both collapses left a paper trail, and the trail shows the same thing twice. The men closest to the Treasury converted their paper into land, gold, and sterling before the write-down, and the people who held to zero were, overwhelmingly, the soldiers who had been paid in it and the farmers who had been told that refusing it was disloyalty. Over the next several minutes, I am going to walk you through the month-by-month collapse of the Continental dollar, the names of the men whose agents bought a nation's debt for pennies while its army went unpaid, the memoir of one private soldier who wrote down exactly what his wages would buy, a Philadelphia shopkeeper who made a fortune printing the Confederacy's money without ever leaving Chestnut Street, and a single sentence in the Constitution of the United States that exists because of the second collapse and that most Americans have never read. And there is one more thing, the strangest detail in the whole story. The United States government maintains to this day that it has never defaulted on the first currency. Technically, that is true. The technicality took 99 cents of every dollar, and before this episode ends, I will show you where it is written down. Here is exactly what this episode will put in front of you. First, the depreciation schedule of the Continental dollar, from full value in 1775 to roughly 40 paper dollars for one silver dollar by the spring of 1780, according to the tables Congress itself adopted. Second, the names, William Duer and Andrew Craigie among them, whose surviving correspondence shows agents riding into the Duer. Joseph Plumb Martin was 15 years old when he enlisted in the Connecticut State Troops in June of 1776, and he served, with one short break, until the Continental Army disbanded in 1783. He was at Kip's Bay when the British landed, at White Plains, at Monmouth in the heat of June 1778, and in the trenches at Yorktown in October of 1781. His pay as a private was $6 2/3 a month, and it was paid, when it was paid at all, in Continental paper. 50 years later, as an old man in the town of Prospect, Maine, he published a memoir of the war. And that memoir is one of the very few places where the collapse of the Continental dollar is recorded, not as an economic curve, but as a series of meals that did not happen. When Martin enlisted, the currency was young and close to healthy. The Continental Congress had authorized its first emission in June of 1775, $2 million, backed by nothing except a printed pledge that the United Colonies would redeem it. Congress had no power to tax. It could only ask the states for money, and the states, fighting their own war, mostly declined. So Congress printed again and again. And by the end of 1779, the total issued had climbed, by the accounting of its own journals, to roughly $240 million for an economy that had never seen a fraction of that sum in circulating coin. Martin watched the consequences arrive in his pay. In the early years, a paper dollar still bought most of a silver dollar's worth of goods. By January of 1778, it took about 4 paper dollars to equal 1 in silver. A year later, about 8. A year after that, 40. And that is the official figure, the exchange rate Congress itself was forced to adopt. By his own account, in roughly 7 years of service, Martin was paid in hard coin exactly once, 1 month's wages in French silver on the march to Yorktown, and he remembered the coins for the rest of his life precisely because they were the exception. The rest was paper that lost value between the day it was promised and the day it arrived. He records months on the edge of starvation while carrying wages that innkeepers and farmers would barely accept. And when the army finally dissolved in 1783, much of what the soldiers carried home for their back pay was not money at all, but settlement certificates, printed promises to pay later, which traded immediately at a fraction of their face. Martin's pension application from 1818 describes a man of almost no property, and he wrote of his fellow veterans in a phrase that has followed the American Army ever since, that they were turned adrift like old worn-out horses. Hold on to Martin's arithmetic, because it was not his alone. It was the arithmetic of nearly the entire Continental line, tens of thousands of men, and of every small farmer who had taken the paper at face value because a state committee had told him that refusing it marked him as an enemy of the cause. Now the mechanism, in plain language, because once you see it, you will recognize it twice. A government at war needed more goods than it could pay for. It could not tax, so it printed claims on the future instead, and every new emission made every existing note worth less, which meant the next purchase required a larger emission, which pushed the value down further. Economists call it a depreciation spiral. The men living through it called it the rising of prices, because from inside, that is what it looks like. The money does not seem to fall. Everything else seems to climb. Two accelerants made the American version worse. The first was law. States passed legal tender acts making refusal of Continental paper an offense, and local committees published the names of merchants who preferred coin, so the currency's value was being held up not by confidence but by compulsion, and compulsion works only on the people within reach of it. The second accelerant was sabotage. The British ran a deliberate counterfeiting operation, printing imitation Continentals aboard H.M.S. Phoenix in New York Harbor, and New York's loyalist newspapers carried advertisements offering counterfeit notes to travelers heading into rebel territory for no more than the price of the paper. A currency held together by trust was being attacked at exactly that scene. Then came the write-downs, and here is where the story splits into two classes of holder. On March 18, 1780, Congress passed an act revaluing the currency at 40-1, which is a polite way of saying it cancelled 97.5% of every wallet in the country in a single vote. Trading value kept falling anyway, past 75-1, past 100 until by 17E. That was the first collapse. 80 years later, the country ran the experiment again. And I want to show you the second collapse through three people, because the pattern only becomes undeniable when you see who was standing where. Start with the people who held. Judith Maguire was the wife of an Episcopal minister driven from her home near Alexandria into wartime Richmond, and she kept a diary through the entire life of the Confederate dollar. The Confederacy, like the Continental Congress before it, had thin tax revenue and a war to feed, and it printed on a scale that eventually passed $1.5 billion in notes. Maguire's diary tracks the result in grocery prices, entry by entry, and by the last winter of the war, her pages and others like them record flour in Richmond at over 1,000 Confederate dollars a barrel and butter at more than $15 a pound, while price tables later compiled by economists studying the collapse suggest that by the spring of 1865 it took something on the order of 60 or 70 Confederate dollars to buy $1 in gold. Set that against a Confederate private's pay, $11 a month for most of the war, raised to $18 near the end. A month of a soldier's service by that final winter bought roughly a pound of butter, and the families holding his wages in Richmond notes were holding them because holding them had been preached in newspapers and from pulpits as a duty. When the government fell in April of 1865, every one of those notes went to zero in a single week, and there was no revaluation act this time, no 40-1. There was nothing. Now the man who ran the money, George Trenholm, was a Charleston shipping magnate whose firm's Liverpool house, Fraser, Trenholm and Company, served as the Confederacy's financial agent in Europe, and in July of 1864 he became the Confederate Secretary of the Treasury. Look at how his own world handled the currency he administered. The blockade-running trade that his firm dominated priced its services in sterling and in cotton, not in Confederate notes. The government's European borrowing, including the famous Erlanger loan of 1863, was structured around cotton because European lenders would not touch the paper. Even the Confederate government itself, and this is the detail I want you to keep, stopped fully trusting its own money. In 1863 it imposed a tax in kind, taking 1/10 of farm produce directly in wagon loads because collecting its own currency was no longer worth the trouble. When the issuer of a currency starts demanding payment in something else, the verdict is already in, whatever the newspapers say. Trenholm's firm was pursued by United States lawsuits after the war and went into bankruptcy, so even the inside track had limits. But the structural fact stands in the records. The men operating the Treasury kept the Treasury's product at arm's length in sterling accounts and cotton bales, while the soldiers' families were paid in the paper and told to believe. And then the case nobody expects. Samuel Upham was a stationer and small-time merchant at 403 Chestnut Street in Philadelphia. In February of 1862, he noticed that a local paper's reproduction of a Confederate note sold out the issue, so he began printing facsimiles of Confederate currency himself and selling them for a cent or two apiece, labeled in the margin as mementos of the rebellion. The label was on a strip that could be trimmed off with scissors. Cotton smugglers and traders crossing the lines bought them by the thousand and spent them in the South as real money, and by Upham's own count, he printed over $1.5 million notes with a face value somewhere around $15 million. The Confederate Congress made passing counterfeit notes a capital offense, and there is an often repeated though thinly documented story that a bounty of $10,000 was offered for Upham himself. Whatever the truth of the bounty, the meaning of the episode is hard to argue with. The Confederate dollar had become so weak and its printing so crude that a souvenir made openly in an enemy city, in the same style of paper and often in better ink, circulated as the real thing, and every fake note that entered the stream pushed the genuine ones further toward zero. One collapse was accelerated by a Royal Navy printing press in New York Harbor. The other was accelerated by a gift shop on Chestnut Street. Different century, same seam. Because a currency built on belief can be attacked by anyone who owns a press. Set the two collapses side by side and 5 patterns repeat, and these 5 are the payoff of everything above. Pattern 1. The fall was gradual, then vertical, and the schedule was nearly the same shape twice. The Continental held close to par for about 2 years, then took roughly 4-1 by January 1778, 8-1 by January 1779, 40-1 by early 1780, per the scale Congress adopted, and then went vertical. The Confederate note, traded at a modest discount through 1862, sagged hard after the summer of 1863, when Vicksburg and Gettysburg broke the military story and went vertical in the final winter. In both cases, the curve tracked belief, not arithmetic. The quantity of paper grew steadily, but the value collapsed in steps, each step landing when a specific piece of news made the redemption story harder to tell. Money like this does not die of printing alone. It dies on the day the story stops surviving contact with events. Pattern 2. The insiders exited in writing, and the writing survives. Craigie's letters describing the debt as a field for speculation. The express writer's fun.